Hello, thanks for tuning in to my channel. It's early morning here, so please excuse the scratchy voice. I'm Carol Irvin, author of the Mountain Women series, historical fiction set in West Virginia in the early 1900s. I'd like to tell you something of my inspiration for this series, the people I met in my 47 years in West Virginia, and the experience of living in that beautiful mountainous area. In a mountainous country, the terrain is challenging and communities are small and sometimes isolated. I believe in places like this, people must try harder to succeed, and most go out of their way to be helpful to each other. Even today, West Virginia is not the easiest place to live, but loyal West Virginians are certain it is the best. I'm sure previous generations had to be extremely hardy and resourceful. I have always been inspired by those qualities. I started writing fiction when I retired. I wasn't sure anyone would want to read anything I had to say, but I wanted to write what was familiar and something I thought was important. What was familiar was the beautiful but difficult terrain of West Virginia and a culture based on hard work and cooperation. The Girl on the Mountain is a story of a young woman abandoned by her husband in a 19th century sawmill town. Prior to the start of the story, May Rose is 17 and is traveling west with her uncle and cousins. On the way west, she meets the handsome, charming, and charismatic Jamie Long, and she's rushed into a hasty marriage. After a quarrel with her family, Jamie takes her back to his home state of West Virginia. There he gets work as a logger and installs her in a remote location several miles from his logging camp. The remoteness of her home is important to the story. When the story begins, May Rose has been married 2 years, living in a cabin with no road to town, only the logging railroad and a forest trail. She has no neighbors and sees her husband only on weekends, and sometimes not even then. He works as a swamper in a logging camp. Swampers cleared brush and fallen trees to make room for skid roads. I'm going to show some old photos of logging, as well as sawmills and coal towns, to give you a better sense of the setting. 6.5 days a week, her husband lives in a logging camp. Most weekends, the log train carries young loggers down to the company-owned sawmill town, where they rest, get drunk, and get up to no good. Logging camps like Jamie's moved around while an area was being cut down. Shacks were lifted onto train beds, and sometimes the housing was actually train boxcars. In The Girl on the Mountain, May Rose's cabin is halfway between her husband's logging camp and the sawmill town in the valley. Here's how the story starts. Chapter 1. When Jamie was home, May Rose felt safe. Saturday afternoons, he jumped from the log train as it slowed down the grade in front of their cabin. Sunday evenings, he caught the train back to logging camp number 6, where he lived through the week. This Saturday, he walked from the train as if dragged down, bits of dust in his thick brown lashes. His sun-dark face bore new scratches, like his hands, scarred by twigs and briars. In the week since she'd seen him, he'd grown a thin, rust-colored mustache. He pulled his suspenders from his shoulders as he came through the door, stepped out of his trousers, and kicked them to a dusty heap. His bath was ready, the washtub partly filled beside the table, crowding their one-room cabin. Kettles of water steamed on the cook stove in the corner. She handed him his drink and added water to the tub. That's the end of the first page. The log train that passed May Rose's cabin was a geared locomotive necessary to handle the steep slopes and heavy loads. For railroad construction, each mountain had dozens of streams and often big gullies and valleys that had to be crossed. Even little wet places had to be shored up for the railroad tracks. Wrecks were common. Logs or boulders might roll downhill, or a hard rain could wash out the trestle. Trains and trestles are important to the story. Logging has always been dangerous work. In those days, teams of horses were used to skid the logs down to the log landing, where they'd be loaded onto flat cars and taken farther down the mountain to the sawmill. In The Girl on the Mountain, a horse team and its driver have been killed, and May Rose's husband wants the driver's job. She hopes he won't get it because he is a poor handler of horses. A cart similar to this has a role in the story. May Rose has decided to make the forbidden trip down to town to see if she can find a house there for her husband and herself, and perhaps some work. She also wants to mail a letter to her family, hoping they'll reconcile so she and her husband can join them in North Dakota. The next portion I'll read describes her trip to town. From habit, May Rose glanced toward distant ridges and sniffed the air. Sometimes breezes carried a scent of coffee or bacon from an unseen homestead. Today, everything seemed ordinary, except her pigs were running loose in the woods, and she was going to town. She needed to post her letter, while its appeal seemed a good idea. By way of the winding railroad track, the company town was 4 miles down. Taking the forest trail was quicker, but she chose the track for its open sky. When she and Jamie had walked the trail, he'd carried the shotgun. She started down the track carrying her shoes, a burlap sack of feathers, and a basket of eggs. A flat straw hat hung by a ribbon around her neck, and she'd braided and pinned up her hair. The letter to her uncle lay in a deep pocket of her dress. She had to believe her letter had gone astray, and not that Uncle Bert was too angry to write, or worse, that something bad had happened on their trip. The track went downhill most of the way, crossing wet places and ravines on wooden trestles, some no more than a few feet high, others braced by tall posts buried in tangles of mountain laurel. At the first trestle, she placed her bare feet on the rails to check for vibration. A train this time of day would be unusual, but these bridges had no separate walkways. If a train surprised her, she'd have to jump off. At the second trestle, long and high, with spaces in the deck, she focused on the other side so she wouldn't get dizzy. Midway across, she heard a clack and whine on the rails, the speeder gearing down. She waved the bag of feathers and the driver pumped his foot on the brake. The speeder's wheels squealed. The speeder was a platform on wheels with 4 posts and a roof. Once she'd seen it carrying 2 standing men who held on to the corner posts. Today it had only one, Dr. Hennig, and his medicine bags. He stopped close to the hem of her dress. "Mrs. Long." She welcomed his voice, the first she'd heard in days. Because they'd never spoken, she was surprised he knew her name. He reminded her a little of her uncle, maybe his black suit and the narrow dark beard. "Dr. Hennig, I'm sorry to be in your way." He stepped to the front of the platform and offered his hand. "Let me carry you across." She set the eggs and feathers on the platform and let him help her up. From childhood, she'd been warned about men offering favors, but everyone trusted a doctor. So May Rose, whose husband has deliberately kept her isolated, rides down to town with the doctor. Will she be able to trust him? Old photos of the lumber industry were very helpful in my research for this story. To give you an idea of the look and sounds of a sawmill town, here are a few more old photos. Logs from the flat cars were dumped into a mill pond and guided up the slipjack into the sawmill. Rural West Virginia was not electrified at that time, so mills burned sawdust to make their own electricity. Notice the slipjack leading from the pond up into the building. In this period, there were hundreds of sawmill towns in the mountains, some nicer than others. A few became permanent communities. Back to the story. After several disturbing encounters in town, May Rose hurries home to her cabin, this time through the woods, because it's too late in the day to walk over the trestles. She hurried across the tracks and through the mill toward mounds of sawdust and lumber docks, where men loaded thick yellow boards onto flat cars. The rhythmic slap of wood on wood slowed as she neared. A worker whistled and called an unfamiliar word, and others hooted. Rude men. She could imagine Jamie among them. She bent her head and stepped carefully around half-buried wood scraps. A voice barked an order. Whistles trailed off in laughter, and the slap on boards resumed. Near the docks, a footbridge held by cables crossed the river to a few sheds and the start of the trail up the mountain. The bridge swung with her first step. Loose boards shifted, showing the river below, shallow, rocky, and fast-flowing. She squeezed the rusty handrail. On the other side, she leaned against a tree and pulled the shoes from her swollen feet, an effort like husking a tight ear of corn. She tied the shoelaces to each other and hung them in the basket to the sash at her waist, then found 2 stout walking sticks, extra legs for the climb. Ahead lay a brushy slope of rotting stumps and fallen crowns of ancient trees. She was not certain how to find the opening to the trail, but when she came out of the brush, she saw it, a dark space between 2 giant trunks. Entering the forest was like pulling a blanket over her head. Ahead was a faint corridor with a blanket of pine needles and leaves, fresh and brittle on top, loamy underneath. Her toes spread into the leaves and gripped the soil, lifting musky scents. She pushed the sticks hard against the ground to release her anger and to chase away anything hidden that might bite. Her thoughts reduced to essential truths. She would not come through another winter alone without turning crazy as the preacher's mother, or drunk as the woman in the green dress, and she would no longer be like a poor hen pecked by the flock, the one she wished would peck back. The trail twisted upward, skirting rock outcrops, damp ravines, and dense mountain laurel that grew tall with shining leaves and white flowers. Here and there a ray of sunlight fell through the canopy, brightening an orange leaf or a spot of lichen-crusted rock. She might say nothing to Jamie, fatten the pigs another month, and somehow sell them on her own. One thing she knew, if he sold the pigs, she would never see the money. Going home, always bare left, Jamie had said, but the path was sometimes hard to distinguish. According to the old tales, men and deer alike had lost their way and starved to death in the miles of laurel. When she'd followed Jamie, she'd given no attention to landmarks. An hour or more might have passed, with treetops covering the sky. She had only fatigue to judge the time. Where the trail crossed a tiny stream, she refreshed her feet in cold water, sat on a rock, and wiggled them dry. Behind her, foliage crunched, and she held her breath and clutched her walking sticks like clubs, remembering stories of panthers trailing prey. Something moved at the edge of her vision, and she straightened and felt her flesh expand like a rooster, puffing up to look fierce. In the silence, water dripped. Wolves, Jamie said, had left these mountains long ago, and only a few wild things did not fear humans. Skunks, for one. A human's greatest threat was another human. She listened until she felt foolish. If someone wanted to do her harm, he could have done it already. Trudging on, watching the ground, certain she'd gone too far on the wrong path, she came around a tree and was struck by a furious beating of the air. She ducked and shielded her head as leaves and feathers fell. Above her, a turkey gobbler beat his wings in a struggle to lift away. She'd thought she was dead. She'd barely caught her breath when the ground rumbled underfoot, and Nellie and all 8 pigs burst through the trees and bumped around her legs. They wheeled and raced on, but came back to crisscross her path as though leading the way. Ahead she saw a column of daylight. The pigs ran through it, and she stepped out under the sky. Home. Grateful, she paused at the edge of the clearing. Directly ahead, chickens pecked at dirt near the stream. Nellie and the pigs slowed and trailed toward the hog lot. Catching a sudden, strong odor of smoke, she whirled to see her cabin. All seemed fine. Then she turned the other way. In her garden plot, the scarecrow was afire. That's the end of chapter 4. From there, everything gets worse for this young woman, but she persists, desperate and determined, rewarded finally by new friends and eventually a family. This and other books in the Mountain Woman series present the story of her life. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to the Girl in the Mountain. You can read the entire first chapter on my webpage and find the Mountain Women series on Amazon and at other online booksellers.